My name is Tim Love. I'm the BSA president this year. I have a short reign of only 12 months, but I've been working very hard with the BSA staff and the board to try to make the BSA more impactful around issues of public policy and urban design. So that's really been my focus. And to channel the focus, we've been running a series of what we're calling urban design workshops. The first happened last September. For those that were involved or heard about it, it focused on what MassDOT was doing with the interchange redesign at Alston, Cambridge. I got a call from somebody that said there was an urban design emergency, so we put together a charrette very quickly with design professionals to try to up MassDOT's game relative to the urban design potential around what was happening there. And it ended up being quite impactful relative to the state's scoping of the next phases of the project. The problem was that set a pretty high bar for what to do next, but the mayor's announcement about these new residential development growth corridors seemed like an excellent new opportunity, if not a design emergency, but a way that we could take the same recipe of these urban design workshops and shine a design light on a discussion that's been mostly policy focused. So that seemed to be a different way that the BSA could contribute in an emerging conversation about how to get more housing to happen in the city. So with that, we talked to people at the BRA and Sheila Dillon at DND, tested some ideas with them, but didn't seek their approval, but tested some ideas with them, and came up with what we're going to explain tonight. So what we're going to do tonight is a couple of things. I'm going to explain a little bit about the charrette, the teams, and the structure of it, and that might end up being a source of discussion too, maybe from a policy standpoint about how New York might copy this. I'm happy to come down and help. I'm going to explain the structure of the charrette, the teams, the problem, and what they've been asked to focus on. They're actually starting at dawn tomorrow. And then that's going to also maybe inform the way the panel discussion goes, how larger policy issues, let's say, can reflect on the charrette and how those things might be related. So if that makes sense, that's great. So I decided to reverse engineer the presentation and describe the site that we're going to tackle first so that everybody has in their mind's eye when we get into policy issues what we're talking about. The site is located just north of the Andrew T stop, literally a half a block away. It's quite a large parcel, and it's mostly vacant. What's important about the site is that it abuts an existing residential neighborhood that's a little bit orphaned here from the rest of South Boston, but it's quite intact, and there's been some recent development there recently, even new infill development. And one of the things that's very nice about the site is that from the site that we've identified, there are a series of nice existing residential streets to get to this incredible park system without going through industrial areas or being on larger arterial roads. So it has this hidden value that we discovered as we were looking at sites. It's also a good site too because the whole Dorchester Avenue corridor is one of these growth zones to be defined, but it's the only one that doesn't have pre-existing businesses on it, so except for that parking lot. So it was a kind of safe house for us to play around with this without getting into questions about industrial districts and the need for backstreet things and all these other policy issues, which I know are also part of the debate about growth zones. So zooming into the site, there it is. We relatively arbitrarily defined its boundaries, but in a fairly defined way because the teams are going to be asked to produce some metrics too. We ran some test metrics. I don't have those in the presentation tonight. We can ask me later about those, but we want to have the teams individually in an aggregate generate FAR, units per square foot, acre, and some numbers to help with the policy people. Now, these are the owners. It's actually relatively few. Again, MAR uses this for parking. There's some small businesses and things here. The big red area is completely vacant. And that's a picture of it. That's current conditions. And this is Ward Street. I can't see from where I am anything at all, but this is Ward Street, which is the best street to walk on to get to the park system and the waterfront from the development, which is also part of the logic. Now, for a variety of reasons, when we ran the Beacon Yards Urban Design Workshop in September, we had 2 different professional teams look at the same site. We realized it would be more interesting and maybe more germane to policy if we actually got 3 or 4 different teams to do schemes on adjacent sites and then put them all together to see what kind of Frankenstein monster resulted from that. It's the strategy of this exquisite corpse, if you know that, and I don't have time to explain that now, but if each team did something good within a master plan, it would be fun at the final review, which is on Thursday, to see what would happen if you put them all together. Are you with me? And so what we ended up doing, I got the team leaders together, Gretchen, Tamara, some other people, and we came up with a provisional master plan for the site that imagined 4 teams participating, so we have 4 sites, imagined Ward Street coming through, and it also proposed an extension of Ellery Street through the site to a remnant of that street in the industrial area. We counted the beans. They seem to be good size development sites for the kind of housing that's happening in the city anyway. We threw some open space in the middle to add some value and to make the problem more complex. And it's not an official master plan. It's nothing more than a getting started for a charrette master plan, but Devin seems to like it though. He's like, we'll do it. The city's, it's been signed off immediately. So we're already having an impact. And then what we did is we made a digital model with our new street network. The streets are worked out per Boston's Complete Streets guidelines with the right lane widths and parallel parking. And then we were simply just assign the different team leaders to the different sites. And so that's, you know now as much as the team leaders know. The teams are comprised of the people that I'll explain in a minute, but also emerging professionals in each of the teams. Each team has signed up a landscape architect, a transportation consultant that's going to help, a kind of team that's going to, just in 3 days, do the best they can on the sites. What we propose to the teams is that density is really up to them, but looking at precedent further up Dorchester Avenue, we're proposing a height limit of 70 feet along Dorchester Avenue, which is what the McAllen Building and Court Square Press are. And you can go up in density as long as you can make an argument for it as you run back to the tracks, to the rail yard. We tested an FAR of 4.7 here, because that's if you line these sites with a 6-story max out wood frame perimeter block, you get 4.7. So we ran those numbers as a kind of beta tester for the teams, so at least they had some thing to look against when they were doing their own thing. Again, it's weird, this is what we actually do for developers when they come to us, a kind of an early parcel test. So who are the team leaders? I don't know people I know. No, they are people in the city and region who, in my little BSA team, we thought had done some innovative housing in the recent past that had an impact on some of the discussions. Beth Whitaker, who I don't think is here tonight, is the founding principal of Merge Architects. She's doing a couple interesting projects now, but the one that some of you might know is this Penn Street Lots in Quincy, which is a very interesting project. Eric Howler from Howler Yoon is doing the first phase of the Magellan development at Union Square, and we're working, because we're the urban designers for that project. Eric's doing some very interesting things for, is that parcel 2D? Is that what it's called, Eric? D2, okay. There's an emerging professionals group that's headed up by Jess. Where's Jess? And that's a committee in the BSA, and it's a fully energized team that wants to kick the ass of the more established architects. So they're doing Site C, and then Brian Healy, who many of you know, did the very interesting float yard proposal that won a BSA on Build Award 2 years ago, is the third team. So that's what we're up to. This is not, the problem with the word charrette is that people, it's a word that means community outreach and people around tables coming in to give their feedback. Just to be very clear, this is a professional charrette in 3 days to just get a bunch of ideas on the table that you wouldn't get otherwise. And we can talk about the merits and not of that maybe too. So what's the policy background for this? I think at a very high level, it's the as a result of the new Housing a Changing City Boston 2030 plan, the decision that 53,000 new housing units needed to be generated by 2030. That's a unit number that's blind to subsidized, affordable, market, workforce. We'll talk about that a little bit. That's an aggregate number. Again, I said that the 2 priority development zones that have been at least announced so far are the Dorchester Avenue corridor that we're working on, but also Washington Street and Jamaica Plain, the Arbor Way bus terminal, and headed to the Forest Hill Station. We heard from Sheila that there's others in the works being planned by the city. And the goal for the charrette and the city's priority is to, at least as a first step for the housing goal, is to find a way to solve that gap in the supply between subsidized, affordable, and what's being built now, which is all being marketed as luxury. We're doing a project now, and they're calling it luxury, and I'm like, really? So I think that that's really what we mean by workforce in the case of the charrette. And so what does that mean? In a recent discussion with Sheila Dillon, she said it's households that make between $50,000 and $120,000 a year, the middle class, and that could be anything from a couple living in a 1-bedroom that make 120 to a family of 4, I suppose. But the idea is that if you make as a household more than 120 and you're just a couple, you're into the luxury market. That there's a product for you. And so that's what we mean for the purpose of the charrette. We mean by workforce housing. What can the market do to meet to fill that gap? And then we had a long discussion about this, and there was much anxiety and hand-wringing. What's the role of design as part of the broader policy discussion? Design can't directly address the whole labor union question and the cost of labor. It can't directly address questions of public subsidy and where that might be parked to help meet this need. There's a lot of discussion about where the public has to step in to bridge the gap. And it can't really focus on the tools that we can use in Boston to incentivize the growth zones, but in some ways it can too. So what are ways that design can be part of the discussion? Certainly being more creative about densities and housing types. Providing some visions for what that looks like that help policymakers sell higher densities. If there aren't good pictures to show, people tend to be against them. Creative new unit types that meet, there was an article about millennial units in the Globe last week that micro units, modular, there's a whole menu of things that have been discussed but not actually tested. And then the project delivery issues of modular, which have to do with labor, but they're also design issues too. Renee's telling me to hurry up, I can tell by her eyes. I think the other piece of this is that I think the images matter. And I think that I like to imagine what policy people think of, what pictures they have in their heads when they're walking around talking about housing policy. And I think they only have 2 pictures in their head. Post-Hope 6 housing, the top image, that's good housing, but it's not appropriate for higher density sites, so what do you do? Or luxury stuff like the Millennium Project, but there aren't good images of what we're actually talking about, and that's hopefully what the charrette can help deal with. And I also think that because we've got 4 teams working together to make a little neighborhood that abuts an actual existing neighborhood, that we need to think about housing not just on a per project basis, but how it adds up to new neighborhood building, especially in the growth zones where whole new neighborhoods can be imagined. And so one of the examples I studied doing some research a couple of years ago, BO01 in Malmö, Sweden, was actually a state-sponsored project to make a whole new district from scratch, allowing as many different housing types to populate it as possible, and it's quite successful. The other model for this, it's a little bit more old-fashioned, was a German program called IBA, and there's been some new versions of this in other cities, in addition to Berlin, which was a way to actually leverage the design questions around housing to not only increase the housing stock, but actually put Berlin on the cultural map by attracting design talent to the city at a point when the economy was fairly moribund. So there are some things in a strategy like this for Joyce Linehan as much as they are for Cairo Shen and for Sheila Dillon, which is that if we think about housing as a design problem too, and even frame larger development areas with a slightly more proactive design agenda, there might be other benefits. So I think that concludes the discussion. I only want to make a pitch for people to come back on Thursday. We are going to review the schemes that the teams put together. We have an interesting collection of people coming. Ed Nardi, who's a developer who is sitting in the back somewhere, but he's on his phone, who has a lot of experience with this kind of housing, 2 new developments along D Street by the Convention Center. Dan Doka from Interborough Partners, who's going to provide a kind of planning, sociological lens on the outcome. Nader Charanier, who built a luxury project nearby, the McGowan Building, is going to look at these schemes, I presume from a design perspective. And Sheila Dillon, who has agreed to come and offer her opinions as well. So that's it.
Thank you, Tim, for setting the stage so well for us. I'm Renée Loth. I'm the editor of ArchitectureBoston magazine and a columnist for the Boston Globe. Last spring, we published an issue of ArchitectureBoston magazine called Blueprint for the New Mayor. It was a look at the design challenges facing the first new administration in Boston in 20 years. There are some copies over there if people haven't had a chance to see it. We took a look at transportation, public space, some of the cultural divisions that still bedevil Boston. But by far the largest problem and the most intractable problem in the city that we found as a design challenge for the new mayor's administration was the persistent lack of affordable housing for workforce communities. That is, as Tim has described, we're not exactly talking about publicly subsidized government housing. We're talking about housing that average working Bostonians can afford. As anyone with eyes can see, there's a lot of development going on in the city of Boston, particularly in the core, and a fair amount of housing that's being developed as well. But it is the market rate for these houses or for these units are unaffordable for the majority, I might even say the 99% of the city of Boston. If we're not going to have a city that is completely populated by hipsters and empty nesters, we need a radical increase in the number and the variety of housing units here in Boston. So tonight, in the next 2 days, everybody's going to be really zoning in on the site in Dorchester. But tonight, we're going to take a somewhat broader look at the problem of affordable housing in Boston. And we have a terrific panel to help us do that. I should also add that this conversation is being recorded by the WGBH Forum Network. I have some language here somewhere about it. And it is a joint venture of NPR and PBS. And it will be available online when it's ready. If you sign up over at the desk there, where there's also information about continuing education credits, we'll be sure to let you know when the recording is available. So I'd like to start by introducing our panel. We're going to have a conversation of about 45 minutes, just a sort of wide open conversation among the five of us, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So I'm going to try to do this in order. Ricky Golden is project director of Corcoran Jennison Companies here in Boston. She develops both market rate and mixed income properties with a focus on urban residential and mixed use developments. She's responsible for all aspects of the development process, including sourcing and developing new deals. Prior to Corcoran Jennison, although she doesn't look old enough to have had a job before then, Ricky worked for several years at Continental Ventures Realty, a private ownership development firm in Manhattan. Next, I believe we have Devin, yes? Okay, where's Devin? Quirk. Devin Quirk is the Director of Operations for the City of Boston's Department of Neighborhood Development. He oversees all of the day-to-day policy and management activities for a staff of 150 and a budget of $80 million, so we'll all be asking for a little bit of that. This includes developing affordable and market rate housing, managing the city's complete real estate portfolio, fostering small business development, working to end homelessness, and helping Bostonians become and remain homeowners. So that's a bit of a operation there. Tamara Roy, as we heard earlier, is an architect and urban designer specializing in multifamily residential, academic, and commercial projects for Ad Inc., now with Stantec. She was the design team leader for the new residence hall at Mass Art, known as the Treehouse, very popular new building in Boston, and she's also designed residence halls at UMass Lowell and other universities around the state. Her housing portfolio includes several projects in Boston, including several in this neighborhood, which include market rate, affordable, and so-called innovation units. She is, as we heard earlier, the incoming president of the BSA, and I probably should have said this first, a proud member of the ArchitectureBoston editorial board. And then we're really pleased to welcome here Jeffrey Shoemaker from New York. He's the chief urban designer for the New York City Department of Planning. He's helped shape plans for neighborhoods in New York as diverse as Coney Island in Brooklyn and the Hudson Yards in Manhattan. And he's currently working on the implementation of Mayor Bill de Blasio's affordable housing plan, which includes a series of comprehensive neighborhood studies that they're doing all across the 5 boroughs, looking at zoning changes to promote the production of higher quality mixed income housing. And then we're very also happy to have Crystal Hornegay here, who is the brand new Undersecretary for Housing and Community Development.
I still have that new Undersecretary smell.
For the state of Massachusetts. She comes to her government job, honestly, as a former neighborhood development expert. For the past several years, she's been president and chief executive of Urban Edge, which is one of the city's premier community development corporations. Urban Edge has developed something like 1,500 units of affordable housing, mostly in the Roxbury and Jamaica Plain neighborhoods. Prior to Urban Edge, she was project manager and real estate director with the Community Builders, which is a national nonprofit development organization. So we have got an array of talent here. We've got developers, planners, architects, government officials. So let's just get to it. So part of what we're trying to develop here in this evening's conversation are some innovative new ideas for this kind of intractable problem. But first I thought we might want to just define the problem. So this first question is kind of a jump ball. Anybody really can answer it. It's not directed to anyone individually. I hope you'll all have something to say. I was talking to Tamara this morning, and we were saying that this is one of these situations that you know, that old story about the people, blind people, or people with a blindfold describing an elephant. Everybody sees the problem differently depending on what part they're touching. So I think this is a good example here with an array of representatives of the community and the profession to answer, which is, what is the problem? Why is it so difficult to design and develop affordable housing in the city of Boston? Jump ball. Who's first?
I can take a first stab. So I think this is sort of so the easy first answer, right? That it's a supply and demand problem. We were talking a little bit about this beforehand, and on the demand side, people want to move to Boston, which is really exciting. We're an attractive, competitive place to live. And when we were writing the mayor's housing plan last summer, we did some great, really in-depth demographic projections about what Boston might look like by 2030. And we're expecting there to be about 700,000 people living in the city by then. To accommodate for that demand, we're going to have to build 53,000 units of housing, as you heard Tim say. And just to give you a sense of how many units of housing that is, that's a 20% increase in Boston's residential density from where we are right now. It's about the same number of housing units as the town of Brookline. So we need to build the town of Brookline all over again in Boston, and that's a challenge in and of itself. And on the supply side, that we need to build that quick enough so that it can have an effect on prices and rents in the city. So I think that's one way of framing it.
Anyone else? That's the capitalist approach, supply and demand, basic Adam Smith thing. Is there something else that's getting in our way?
Well, the good news is Renee and Tim both did a great job of already outlining everything on my list for what I see the problems are. So although we're all coming at it from different angles, it's surprising that they're all overlapping. We all are seeing the same issues. Production cost issue is really a big thing for developers, obviously, when you're trying to build for an income bracket that's not protected under inclusionary zoning or getting subsidy programs, but that can't quite meet these very high Boston market rents. You're going to have to do something, obviously, on the production cost side. And so that prohibits building high-rise. I mean, I'm sorry if anyone has that in their plan already. I'm sure it'll look beautiful. And density is very important, so I don't want to say that that's not the case, because that'll be a key thing that the city can help us do, is increase density on these sites while knowing that developers are not going to be able to pay high-rise construction costs to build. These will have to stay stick-built, 6-story product, but even that is $250 a square foot hard cost to build. And at rents that fall under this bracket without any subsidy, it is really hard to make those numbers work. And we want to, if you know our company, Cork and Jennison, that's a big part of our mission, and we want to do it, but we have to meet a certain return threshold that's 7%. And if we don't, we can't get a project financed, so these can't get built. So we have to pay very close attention to the biggest cost bulk number, which is that production cost number, and pay attention to zoning and all these other issues that have already been outlined. So I think we're ahead of the game already. The fact that we're talking about this, the fact that the mayor already outlined all these issues and has plans to address them. So I think we'll get there.
If you're saying that high-rises are kind of out of the equation because I'm assuming it's because they're steel and glass and the material expenses, that suggests to me that we're looking at housing that's not necessarily downtown. So I'm looking at tomorrow here because I know this is something that you think we should be, cognizant of.
Right. I mean, one of our quests since 2012, when the mayor asked us, 5 different architects, okay, I'm creating this innovation district. What is innovation housing? And we said, in the end, I actually crowdsourced my staff, and they said, who cares? Because we can't afford to live here. And so what we realized is that when you're working on the waterfront and you're doing high-rise construction with below-grade parking and everything, that's about like $400. It's approaching right now $400 a square foot. So that's never going to really yield you. I mean, aside from the inclusionary zoning piece of it, which might be 15% of those units are affordable, it doesn't yield you otherwise anything other than luxury units. So when we look at wood frame and we look at in the neighborhood and we look at no parking, no underground parking, then you can be around $275 or so per square foot. And so that begins to come within the range, as Ricky's saying, where she can start to meet her return on investment. So you're saying that we need to be looking at neighborhoods like the Dorchester corridor that's been identified and other places in the neighborhoods, and that just not everybody in this new growth of Boston is going to be living downtown. Right, and I think one of the reasons Crystal's on the panel is because then when you do move into the neighborhoods, then there's the issue of the neighborhoods.
Right.
Maybe they're not that excited about having even 6 stories is considered a big building in some neighborhoods, and so then you get all this blowback. Just doing that kind of density makes it hard.
Oh, I was supposed to actually
talk now. Well, I will say in my former life that Tamara worked with us on a project that was 6 stories in the neighborhood.
Jackson Square.
In Jackson Square that completely transformed that neighborhood. But one of the things that I learned in my job was that people don't like change, right? And so that goes to say about anything, right? People don't want change, and they don't really want to think about their life changing. So when you talk about building housing, it's really about some stranger coming to live next door to me. And so people react viscerally to that. And the leadership really does have to come from the public sector around mediating those kinds of conversations. Because the reality is, the folks who you're building the housing for aren't actually living there now. And so you're not having conversations with those people, but it's those people who are saying to you what some new group of people should live like, right? Like what kind of housing they should have, how many cars they have. I cannot tell you how many conversations I've had as a developer about cars. I want to build housing, but I need to build parking lots instead. And so there's lots of conversation that goes on around that. And to the extent that the leadership on the public sector can play a role to help, not help, but really lead that conversation, then it's not the developer having to moderate that discussion between the public sector and the actual community, whomever we might decide that is. So.
And of course, the parking question has become even more intense after this past winter, where I don't mind admitting I live in Brighton and I've lived there for 40 years, I've lived in this house for about 22 years. And for this year, for the very first time, I used a space saver. I don't mind admitting. I was absolutely dead set against them, politically, every other way, neighborly, not this year. So I think, people are feeling particularly, protective of their parking after this winter. Jeff, this is a little bit unfair for you because you're not here from Boston, but you look like you have something to say. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's fascinating to me is that we could have this same exact conversation in New York, and we are having the same conversation in New York. We have a housing affordability crisis as well. I think the numbers are slightly higher as far as the total target number that we're looking at, but and it requires you to kind of look at it from every possible angle. Whether it's looking at specific neighborhoods or corridors, if it's looking at what are the rules and regulations that are getting in the way. In New York, we have some pretty tight zoning envelopes, so we're actually in the process of loosening those slightly, and you would be amazed at the reaction that we're getting. But it gets to your point that people don't like change. I mean, ultimately, people, they're sort of familiar with a certain scale and neighborhood character, and although we're not talking about changing the character. If we want to recognize the fact, and it was the #1 issue that Mayor de Blasio ran on, is affordability. And the only way we can tackle that is if we look at where we can build more housing throughout the city. There's also a big conversation about preservation of the affordability. So it's not just building housing for somebody else, but it's also, as we're adding more housing to neighborhoods, how can we ensure that people who are there today can stay? And so first and foremost, that's something that we've had to, any neighborhood that we're working in, we have to have a very kind of ambitious preservation program in place before we can even talk about anything new.
And I would just add on the topic of change, there is a change happening, right? So right now, Boston is 20% low income subsidized affordable housing. And we're a national leader, and we want to maintain that national leadership, and that's mainly a budget question. But what's changing is what does the rest of the housing stock look like? Right. And if we don't do something differently from a policy perspective, as a group perspective, Boston will become a city of 20% low income subsidized housing and 80% luxury housing. Mm-hmm. So how do we change that conversation in order to make the community feel comfortable, or help the community feel comfortable with a sort of increased density and policy changes that enable workforce housing, and help them see that as a way to protect their interests of their community. And I think that's happening to some extent. So if we talk about senior housing, seniors is one of our fastest growing demographics in Boston. By 2030, we'll have about a 50% increase in the number of seniors. If we're incentivizing the development of senior housing in Main Street districts or in communities, people who live there now see that as an opportunity for them to age into that new type of housing and maintain living in their community. So I think there's some way we as public officials can help change that conversation a little bit.
You know, I think that many people in the audience here, Devin, would like to know more about the growth zones that have been identified by the administration, the Dorchester Avenue area and Washington Street over by Forest Hills-ish, that part of Jamaica Plain. What does it mean to be a growth area? How is it going to affect development there? I mean, is it just expedited permitting, or is it going to be, you don't need parking spaces? I mean, what is going to be special about those areas?
So I think the residential density is the short answer to that question. So I think when we're looking at growth zones, we're looking at what are ways we can achieve economies of scale and incentivize the rapid reduction of workforce housing adjacent to existing neighborhoods. So two good things about the growth zones that we've identified already. They're not smack dab in the middle of South Boston. They're adjacent and underutilized land where there is the opportunity for growth that won't necessarily dramatically impact the residents that live there already, but can achieve scale in a way that will also support the existing community. So that's, I think, the biggest, most visceral change. I think we do need to have conversations around parking, and they certainly both are transit-oriented sites, so that's an important part of what a growth zone is. And the mayor's really interested in exploring other growth zones in the city. So these certainly won't be the only two. And the Boston Redevelopment Authority, as they move forward with a comprehensive plan for the city, want to tie the growth zone initiative into that effort. So that's a conversation we'll have to have with the community as a whole, and talk to what is it that those groups feel comfortable with in terms of increased density. But as administration, we're committed to density in those areas.
You know, Jeff, we were talking about zoning here, and in Boston, the zoning is kind of this kabuki theater, experience where everybody knows the rules, and yet there are no rules. It's sort of almost nothing is built as of right.
Yeah.
Everything is a negotiation. People complain about it. Architects, developers complain about it bitterly, unless they're the few lucky ones who understand how to play the game, and then they love the system. I guess I'm wondering what you might have to tell us here about the New York experience with zoning, how it can be a tool to help incentivize housing that people can afford.
I should first say that we have our own little kabuki theater, and when you're not doing as of right, that's really when you come into city planning. I think one of the things that we're always looking towards zoning is to try to, how can we use the tool of zoning, which can be quite cryptic, certainly as a tool for good design, to encourage the kind of things that we like to see. One of the things that we have, which you probably know about, is the inclusionary housing program. So we give additional floor area if you provide a minimum percentage of affordable units. The problem is that we've found that our zoning envelope doesn't actually fit the additional floor area. So there's no real incentive there for developers to take that on. And so there's the inclusionary program, there's kind of transit improvement, there's a whole series of these potential bonuses. But so we're actually in the process, and I mentioned this a little bit before, of kind of loosening the envelope just slightly, so that we could start to allow the floor area that's already given, that's already there, to actually fit on site. And what I like about it from the design side is that it actually allows architects to be architects in a way that the rules, because the envelope is so tight that they're kind of forcing the floor area into the envelope in a way that it doesn't allow for the kinds of design innovation that we like to see. So to me, it's kind of a win-win. And again, it's a way that the city's getting in the way of innovation and production, and we should get out of the way. There are other things that are making it very expensive and difficult to build in the city. We shouldn't be in the way of that as well.
So you're finding that actually loosening up the zoning requirements, at least you're hoping, will actually lead to better quality housing as well as more affordable housing, right? So it's not just cheaper, but better.
Yeah, exactly. And we've talked to many architects. I've been in the city for 8 years now, and every year I've been there, it's just, come on, give us a little bit of flexibility here, and this doesn't mean that we're throwing out all the principles that we care about. We still have contextual zoning. We still care about height. We care about context, but it's just giving a little bit there that we think will actually go a long way.
I have a question for Crystal, which, I know that you're newly minted over there in the Baker administration, but last year, when he was a candidate, Charlie Baker came here to the BSA and had a little conversation with a few members of the BSA board and staff, which I happen to be part of, and we were all really impressed, of course, by how sort of wonkishly into the details he was, and he really understood a lot of the very specific, granular challenges that architects and designers face. And we were talking about affordable housing, and he talked about the potential disposition of public land. This is true of the city of Boston too, but the state's of course bigger. That might help, bring down the cost of housing. And he said that the largest property owner in the state was actually the MBTA. Of course, they have other priorities right now, the MBTA, trying to get the trains to run on time or at all. But I'm wondering if you have anything to say about the importance of the disposition of public land being part of this equation.
That's a great question. So as part of the Baker administration's budget, there's a little bit of money in there. As part of the urban agenda, there's $1 million that's really intended to help municipalities do what the city of Boston did for the Jackson Square developers, which was to give us some capital for land that we had control of to do sort of site planning, right? So the sites that we're talking about in Jackson Square, there's like 6.5 acres of land that's not contiguous, that was publicly owned by a bunch of different public agencies. So MBTA had some land, Highway had some land, DCAM had some land, the city of Boston had some land, and it all got built in this part of town in which there was the Stony Brook actually runs through there. So there's a waterway, and there were a bunch of what am I trying to say? Breweries along the waterway. So there's this big conduit underground that's as big and wide as a Mack truck can drive through. And so we had all these things that we had to figure out around how to build over it and how to build around it and if we could move it. And so we needed money as developers to actually do that. And so one of the initiatives that the Baker administration is doing through this program is to help municipalities prepare sites for disposition, so that reduces the cost burden on the developer, and which you then have to actually, because you got to charge for that, right? Like, you can't do that for free. And so to the extent that we can encourage municipalities to think about their public land as a resource, that would be great. We would appreciate that. So.
And we appreciate that.
And developer to developer.
Yeah. I was going to say that help on land and costs associated with that are a huge help. Increasing density, all the things the city can do, actually expediting the permitting of these priority projects that are for lower income people. But still, that biggest number is that production cost issue, which actually the city can help us with that too, and design can definitely help us all coming together thinking of innovative construction techniques, innovative things we can do with design to make these places feel better while spending less on that production cost. But land is a huge help, and all of these zoning policies can really help us move it through. But that production number, I really want to stress, is like that's 70 to 80% of the cost of building a new building. So the fact that we're all coming to the table on that too is really wonderful and helpful.
Well, Ricky, talk a little bit about what some of those innovative design and construction solutions might be. I mean, in order to get that per unit cost down.
Yes, I mean, I'm not an expert in those construction techniques. I would love to invent a new one. That would be a I'm very proud of that. But ones I've heard of are, modular, which I've never built a modular project, so I can't even speak to that very much. Probably the designers know more about designing those. And actually, Jeff and I were just talking about block and plank, which is something that's used in New York a lot. I've never built with that, so I want to learn about all of these and figure out what's going to make these projects work. And maybe it's even as simple as when you're expediting these types of projects, time is money, and if you can shave off a few months of the permitting process, you can get to your return sooner and maybe afford to spend more on production. So that's another big solution. But those are the two construction techniques I know of, and I would love to learn about more or invent one.
And how about like design? I'd be interested in hearing from the designers or anybody. How about the design innovations? Whether the sort of typology of the unit, or the way it's configured, or there must be something tomorrow. Something there.
Tomorrow,
Yeah.
give us something.
So, yeah,
It's the end of the softball question.
Now, one of the things that we loved hearing about the Growth Zone's goal from the mayor was also to focus as much as we could on small unit housing, right? Which was really important because it turns out that actually we have a ton of large family housing in the city that is right now being filled by singles and couples. And there's very, very little small unit housing. So I actually brought my little fact sheet here just to bore you with percentages for a second. But 37% of households are right now saying they're single. 31% is couples. And so if you put that together, 68% of our population in Boston is a single or a couple. And yet when you look at the actual amount of studios, for example, in the city, it's 7% of the total. Right? So all of those singles and couples are trying to either, bunk up but we have a limit of 3 unrelated people in any unit in Boston, so that is a limitation. But so, my sort of numbers thing, the end of the numbers thing is that even if we built all of the mayor's 53,000 units as studios, when you aggregate that in the total, we'd still only have 16% studios in the city. So there's a huge mismatch, which is why I've been on this quest as mother of the micro unit to try to push smaller units. But one of the sort of frustrations of that actually, which is sort of what Ricky was saying about the cost side and the production side, is that a micro unit, as currently thought about by developers, has its own bathroom and its own kitchen, and they have to be luxury because of the cost of the project. And so you end up with, as many people write about in the news, a small unit that is going for $1,800 or $2,200 a month. So that is not affordable. So where I think the innovation lies actually is in trying to rethink things like single room occupancy, lodging houses, residential hotels, all those typologies that used to be in all of our cities, in New York and Boston and San Francisco, and aren't, where somebody really just rents enough space for them to live, and maybe they have a private bathroom because just nobody will ever share a bathroom anymore. It's just like par for the course. And I guess I wanted to bring up this one example that we had researched within our office, which is in Seattle, of this guy, Jim Potter, developer in Seattle, who created these things called apartments. And what he did, got a bad name, right? But what he did was he grouped 6 to 8 bedrooms with just a microwave and a tiny little half a fridge and a bathroom around a kitchen living room. And he called that a unit. So that was his housing unit. Totally scammed the zoning, right? And now Seattle is very busy rewriting their zoning to make this illegal. Right? But he was in Microsoft land, and so what he also did, which was very creative from the developer side, was he rents them out for 3 months as a short lease, right? And so because it became transient lodging, he bypassed a lot of the Fair Housing Act rules and a lot of other rules. He was really a master at bypassing rules. But he got the young folks who didn't have, a whole year's rent to put down a security deposit to be able to move in and have these 3 month short-term things. And there's a huge waiting list for his projects. You know,
One
things
of them
like
in my
that.
neighborhood, like saying. Jeff, do you have something
Yeah,
to
I
add?
just wanted to say Tamara's quest extends to New York as well, because she was one of the people that we talked to when we did our Adapt NYC microunit pilot a few years back, and we're actually building one now. It's an entirely microunit building, which in New York is anything less than 400 square feet, which there are a lot of apartments in New York smaller than 400 square feet. But our zoning actually prohibits in most cases anything less than that dimension. So we sort of explored what other cities are doing, including here in Boston and in Vancouver and Tokyo and London, and they're sort of innovating in these really small units in a way that can match up with the demand. I mean, we have a similar sort of very high percentage of people who want studio and one-bedroom apartments in New York. They don't need these huge apartments, and are willing to take a smaller amount of space if the design is there and it's sort of designed to work. And you can certainly show that you can design a very nice unit in a small amount of space.
Kevin?
So I might also add to Tamara's list of potential areas for innovation, potential type student dorms. So, as everyone knows, Boston has a tremendous number of students living going to school in Boston. There's about 150,000 students in the city of Boston alone attending school. That doesn't even count Harvard and MIT and schools in Cambridge. More than half of those students are living in Boston, and about 36,000 of those students are living off campus within city limits. So part of the mayor's housing plan is also about creating student dorms at scale. The plan calls for 18,500 new dorm beds by 2030. The good news is we're about halfway there with dorm beds that are already in the pipeline. But we got to find new models and unlock new capital to build those dorms. Historically in Boston, it's been universities who have paid for and developed and managed dorms. But I know that there is interest in the private market to get into the dormitory business, and I think the mayor is interested in exploring that with developers and seeing how we might add innovative student dorm designs as a potential way to actually create workforce housing. Because every one of the students that move out of those triple deckers in your neighborhood, Renee, and into these dorms, that's freeing up that unit for families.
Yeah, I mean, Tamara and I actually have gone around on this a couple of times because I don't deny these figures that you have. I'm sure they're true. That there's a tremendous demand for singles, and there's a lot of singles living in Boston. I think, in fact, Boston is maybe third in the nation in the smallest amount of people under 18 living inside the city. In other words, San Francisco, Seattle, and Boston are the three youngest cities in the country, but I'm not sure that's not where's the chicken egg situation there. The people, families don't move into Boston because there's no housing for them, and the occupancy of the two-family houses in my neighborhood by 4 unrelated jocks from recently graduated from BC is taking what used to be a family an apartment off the market for families. So I mean that's sort of a win-win, it seems to me. The private development of dorm housing though is something that's new to Boston, and that probably raises some questions.
It's also it's also when you get the pressure in the neighborhoods, right? So I live in Mission Hill, and so it's a neighborhood that, when I moved here 20 years ago, was really a family kind of neighborhood, but it's really adjacent to 3 major academic institutions, and so you get the graduate students who they don't want to live in a dorm when they can live off campus, and their parents can pay X amount of dollars for them to live off campus. And so I just wonder, are you ever going to be able to get them in the dorm? Are you ever going to be able to get them to move from next door to me? Because I would like that, and I would be behind that. But the folks in Mission Hill don't want a dorm, right? Yeah. So it's really trying to find that balance, because certain neighborhoods will get more pressure around those things than others. So Mission Hill, Fenway, And so those become, Austin Brighton, those become sort of student village kind of neighborhoods, and then where are families living?
Yeah.
And that's really the biggest question that we have, because one of the things that I will say about micro units is, like, I don't know about, as a planner, like I'm a planner by education, I don't know about the long-term viability of a micro unit, right? So 100 years ago, when they built the triple decker, they built it for a particular population type, and it just evolved to suit the different population types. So I'm just trying to figure out, like, is that what you're gonna tell me I gotta live in 30 years while I'm a senior in the micro unit? Because X-nay on the micro unit, like, I'm not doing. And so who's living there, and are we having, particularly if the growth is in seniors and not necessarily in these singles, then, you know, what is that? What does that product look like, and who is the sort of buyer of that product in 20 years? Because we have to think about housing that way.
Well, it's not part of my fast facts, but Boston, every time I speak on this subject, actually, there's at least a couple people in the audience who come up afterwards and tell me, I live in a micro unit, right? And it's been grandfathered, you know, since the late 1900s. So actually, Beacon Hill has a huge amount of micro units in it. So it's actually a typology that has spanned over 100 years in Boston, and I think will continue to serve a need.
And whether we're doing technically micro units or not, I think there's a really important principle there, which is smaller units are going to help us get to this production type. So whether it's 300 square feet or a little bigger, as Krista was talking about, I think that's going to really help us get there. And also, I mean, I think it's brilliant what the mayor's thinking about with student housing and pulling students out of a lot of the older housing stock, that freeing that up for, just like David said, for the middle class. But I also would love to see new construction for workforce, for the workforce too, to be able to build a product for them that's not just all the older housing stock too. So I think it would be wonderful to be able to do both.
So Crystal asked a question that everyone in Mission Hill asks when we start talking about student dormitories. How do you know these people are actually going to move out of the triple deckers and the workforce housing if we build the dormant? And I think that's a really important question, I think, for this charrette, because I think that's something where design can actually be very helpful. In order for when that new dorm or that new micro unit or even that new workforce housing unit that's going to attract someone who's living in that triple decker, in order for them to move out, it has to be two things. It has to be attractive, right? It has to be something where they want to live, and it has to be competitively priced. And if it's not those two things, and if the focus of the growth zones are not really attractive housing that is also really competitively priced for the workforce, it's not going to work.
Unless the colleges make the students live there.
That's true. We'll look into that one too.
Well, MIT and Harvard actually have some of the highest rates of housing their graduate students. You know, like in the 80% range. And so they can tell their graduate students, you basically have to live on campus at least for your first year. And I think that helps.
Well, as a former MIT graduate student, I will say that I prefer to live on campus because it's cheaper than living in Cambridge. And so they don't have to tell me to do that. They just have to have an available unit. And so that becomes a challenge as well in Boston. So.
And they're often new and attractive. My grad school apartment is the nicest apartment I think I will ever have. Amazing. So making them attractive and new construction, I think, will bring them in.
And I'm from Brooklyn. I grew up in Brooklyn in Crown Heights, and a nice pre-war building, beautiful parquet floors. And, I don't know nothing about a micro unit. In Manhattan, they do that. And that's really because they chopped up a bunch of stuff. It wasn't like they built them that way. In the same way in Beacon Hill, it's not. Yes, they have micro units, but you're paying Manhattan prices to live in Beacon Hill. And what we're talking about is a product, in Brighton, in Mission Hill, in Dorchester. Like folks live in Dorchester because they don't want to live in micro units. They want to be in neighborhoods with families. And so how are we, we just need to be sure that we're building a durable product that suits folks over time, depending on what flavor we're trying to think about neighborhoods.
We had a conversation sort of similar to this when this blueprint issue came out last spring, and David Lee, who is an architect in developer and does a lot of work in Roxbury, said that, you know, the part of the problem is that people don't want to cross Mass Ave, you know, and that there is housing out there, but we have to see the city as a whole place, and I would even add, you know, Brookline, Cambridge, you know, what if this Boston, Somerville, you know, Boston is a little place, and not, you know, focus so exclusively on downtown, because people are not going to be able to afford downtown. So, I guess I would ask one last question, and then I think we'll go to questions from the audience, and that's, like, is there anything to be optimistic about? Because, I mean, I actually heard a fair amount of good ideas here, but it isn't such a difficult problem, and we've been hearing what we heard in the last 20 years of the previous administration about, you know, more dorm rooms and, you know, all of the things that we discussed today. So, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I'm optimistic that architects and designers are thinking about housing again. You know, I think it's been a long time since designers have taken this challenge on, and I think, you know, as has been said, I mean, we had many great examples of different types of housing in New York and Boston, and we've kind of moved away from a lot of those, and it seems like we have a very limited pool to draw from, and I think that's where design innovation can come in and really kind of look at what are the many forms that housing can take. You know, when you get down to it, bedrooms are generally the same size, bathrooms are the same size, but how it starts to get configured and, you know, and what sort of amenity space do you provide, whether it's for seniors or for young professionals or whoever you're looking
She's
at.
a young professional.
You mentioned the senior issue. So yeah, I mean, I think that's something to be optimistic about.
I'm also very optimistic because we have a mayor who just put out a housing plan that's this thick that I like keep on my desk and reference all the time.
Awesome.
That outlines got some points for that one. That is recognizing all these issues, that's looking at these problems from the perspective of developers and everyone in the city and residents, and is addressing also this middle income bracket that's not getting helped by subsidies and is partially incorporated into inclusionary zoning, but there's even, I would argue, a percentage of people that are out of that bracket but are still kind of outpriced for Boston.
Right.
So we're looking at that. Everybody's getting to the table. The BHA is doing some really innovative, amazing things. They just put out an RP soliciting ideas for a lot of their high market sites, asking developers to be creative and ways to create mixed income communities. So people are really starting to think about housing and in very exciting ways, and that's the only way we're going to get here, and the fact that it's all brought to the front already is a really good sign. So I'm optimistic.
I'm excited by conversations like this. And I think that we're in the timing is great, right? And Boston is really well positioned to be a national leader or even an international leader in solving this type of problem, because we have the resources and we have some of the very brightest and smartest leaders in design and leaders in academics and policy. We have political leadership that's really behind tackling this challenge, so the timing's really right. The mayor just received a $1.3 million grant from the Bloomberg Foundation to stand up a housing innovation lab that actually takes conversations like this one and then puts them into action to create real housing for Bostonians in Boston that are the most innovative solutions in design and in affordability. So I think I'm really optimistic. I think this is a great momentum that we have, and we just have to capture it.
Agree. I think that the fact that we're here for this workshop for the next 3 days, working on a growth zone and trying to help the mayor and his office define what that is as architects and planners, takes, for me, like it's finally there's some optimism to, you know, that next project where you, instead of going in and fighting an uphill battle about trying to increase spot zoning on that site that you're working in and fight with the neighborhoods and everything, to actually have an overlay that says, here are our priorities, here is the density of the site, here is the open space and the layout of the streets, and you just have to plug into it as an architect or a developer, is enormous. What a great, streamlining of the process toward the goal. And then the fact that the vision is so clear as to where we're trying to get, even though it is amorphous on how we get there, at least the vision is there, the stakes in the ground, and we can all just try to drive toward it.
It's great. I wanted to make sure that people in the audience who might have questions have a chance to ask a few. Yeah?
I have a question. Maybe it's a naive one, but we keep talking about housing, but when we talk about, housing is the kind of microcosm of the city. We want our cities to be mixed use and mixed income and diverse. When we talk about housing, we tend to end up in one type, it's studios, one bedrooms, and how could we think about housing to include live work, for example, and what are the barriers to making more spaces available for live work?
Can you explain live work?
Well, when we started out, we had a one bedroom, and we worked out of our one bedroom. And we weren't sure it was completely legal, but we did it, and that's how we started our practice. And we had an employee who came and worked in our studio, and I think there's plenty of people that want that. They want that flexibility to live work, but I think zoning doesn't particularly allow it. Although I'm not sure why. It seems like a benefit to be able to live work. I think creative people are interested in not necessarily commuting to work, but maybe living and working in the same place. It seems like a win. I'm just curious why it isn't done more.
I know that we've done it in Boston. I think the question is why haven't we done it at scale? And I think
couldn't it be encouraged? It seems to be a space saver. It seems to be it seems like all the upsides.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the downside is.
Especially in the growth zones. The danger in high-value neighborhoods like Cambridge is that it's cheaper to rent an apartment than an office space. And so
Right.
Cambridge has the opposite problem, that people are renting apartments to run consulting firms.
Right.
But I think in Dorchester Avenue corridor or Washington Street, it would be a positive policy thing because it would get people during the day instead of commuting into their jobs, making a 24/7 community. So you should propose it as part of your
It would
proposal.
certainly help the traffic, transit problems.
Yeah.
In Somerville, the big question is, can you build jobs as much as you build housing? And developers want to build housing because the job market isn't there. But if it were potentially both, could it swing? Could we think long term? Right now we work in a loft, which is a great building type because it is able to transform from an industrial use to a housing use to a commercial use. If we think about housing as purely housing, we sort of lock ourselves in, but if we think about housing or building types that could evolve, that seems like a design issue. It seems like if we can plan for these things, we could have uses change over time, and then in 25 years or 50 years we wouldn't tear it down, we would just modify it.
Right. That's a great point because it really sort of suits, it really means that we have to take into account the way people live now and how we're sort of designing for the future, right? And so just even in how new construction, where you might not have had to do 10 years ago with all the fit up around technology, right? Like you gotta have that as base now. And so that kind of drives that. And so what does that then mean for, we used to think about live work in only the creative senses, but really people are doing their consultant businesses from home and they've got somebody coming in. And so how are we thinking about spaces and how we use them for that? And is there some way we can have a common space in the building and blah, blah, blah. Especially in places like New York and Boston, in which a lot of that kind of innovation happens. And even with seniors, I'm not a senior, and I'm going to live long enough to be one, though. But even they live differently than seniors before, right? And they're living longer, they're active longer, and so what does that mean for the spaces that we're thinking about for seniors? And so just really thinking about design for the different ways that people live now. I loved our former mayor, as many of us did, but he was a big front yard, backyard kind of guy. And I was just like, ain't nobody sat on the porch, child, in 15 years. But everybody had to have a porch, right? And so just thinking about like that, how communities and how people interact socially have changed and how we do a design model to suit that.
And I think just the perception of work is still, particularly when you're talking about industry, people think of very noxious uses, depending on who you're talking to. So the whole kind of, you know, the reason why we have zoning, you know, Euclidean zoning in the first place was to kind of separate the kind of noxious activity from where people live, you know, and obviously that's changed now. So I think, you know, and it's, you know, changing the rules is never easy, you know, and society changes ahead of us. So it's like, how do we kind of keep up with it is something that we're always, you know, sort of tackling in New York, and I'm sure the same in Boston.
It's so tricky because I think it's a great idea, Eric, but with all due respect, I think a lot of people would think that live work in their neighborhood or in their building would devalue their property. I live in a building that we were told was live work, and then all of a sudden people started opening small offices, and the condo association immediately made it a rule that you couldn't do that because it's a condo building, it's not a rental building. So, and the reason was they didn't want strangers to them coming in their building every day, and clients and so on and so forth. So it's tricky how you mix it. But a question I had, so we're not talking about affordable housing, we're talking about housing that the developer can set the price of. So let's say as a designer, I figure out a way for you to build it for $1 a foot. Aren't you still gonna charge
What you can.
Is that a
what you
question?
can? Yes, I'm looking at you, Devin.
Yeah.
I'm gonna make sure I get my 7%, and then that's no.
I get that.
Right.
So, is the production cost really the biggest problem here?
Absolutely.
Yes, it's true. I promise. It's when I all day I look at financial models and try to make all kinds of projects work, and there's a big production cost issue. It's approximately.
As a nonprofit, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no,
As
please.
a nonprofit developer, right? And so my return is determined for me, right?
Yeah.
So the public lenders say to me how much money I can get as a return on my investment, and still the production cost is a problem. It's not about my return.
I understand that. I believe that the production cost is a problem. My question is, if the production costs weren't a problem, would the sale price really come down significantly?
Yes, I would want to get my return. Same thing that Chris was talking about. I would make sure that my investors.
Even if the market.
Yeah, so it's not the
Demanded
first
for.
unit,
Can support
right?
more.
I think the first unit that's built is, you know, even if it costs you way less to develop, it's still going to be sold at market rate. That's why this is a growth zone, not just a one growth parcel, because if no matter how much density you put on that parcel, it's not going to tilt the overall rent curve, right? So if we can bring enough units on scale,
It's a larger supply issue.
Exactly.
Which is that you're right, short term, but long term, she's going to win if she can sell it for $1 or less a square foot, and then he's going to try to beat you at $2 less a square foot. So once there's enough supply, competition will bring the price down. Right?
Somebody has to go first.
Of
though.
course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I understand.
You had a question.
So I have sort of a comment and a question relative to the production cost. Obviously, I believe in that. And one of the things that shared teams might be able to do is the efficiency factor, which is another way to look at it. One of the ways to really reduce the sort of so-called production cost is to increase the efficiency of the building. That is the amount of leasable versus rentable. So
What do you mean by efficiency? Are you talking about
the amount of
energy efficiency?
leasable versus common spaces, for example. So through typological innovation, we've done this 50 years ago, we stopped doing this, but if there is a way to prove that one could actually do more efficient typologies, that may be one way of getting at reducing the production costs. But the other question that I have to the panelists is related to parking. You touched upon it. And if you think of 53,000 units, and we're still at 1 per 1,000, trust me, right? So 53,000 cars is insane to think about. So what kind of innovative ways can we figure out to convince the community that you don't need that? And I'll just give one example as a sort of a Kickstarter. We're working on a project right now where we set aside a small portion as innovation units that cannot get a city parking permit that's written into the lease, and they don't get any parking. So are there things beyond just zip cars and things like that that we could do to convince communities that we can go down to a 0.5 or a 0.4? And in fact, that's happening in reality. Developers don't want to spend that kind of money, but how do you convince people?
I think the demographic shift is already going in that direction. I barely drive. I don't have a car, and I rely on transit, which is we could have a whole panel about transit, which I would love to be on. But so I think a lot of a lot of young professionals are trying to take transit to work, and I think that's that is what people want. So I think the city is starting to see that and starting to lower parking ratios. I'm doing things trying to do things 0.3, 0.4 because I think that is what people want and what the city wants. So I think we are on the same page on that one.
Yeah, and we're not going to go overnight from where we are today to no parking requirements. So you framed the question exactly correctly, which is what can we do to have that conversation with the community to be able to convince our community members that a lower parking requirement will not be devastating in its impact to the people who live there now. It's a difficult question. I think that's I don't have an answer for that, but that's the way we need to attack the problem. Is together, how can we propose innovative solutions that actually feel comfortable to the existing community?
Right, because the experience has not been that good, right? There was that project in Alston, up there in I don't know, it was up there at the top of Packett's Corner, that was proposed with no parking, and people went crazy. And that Alston is a very student-focused neighborhood with lots of transit and lots of people who don't have cars, and the few who do just said, no, people are going to be parking in my street, because they don't have parking in there. It's a difficult issue.
And it's a green issue too.
The
Yes.
only project that we've worked on where it actually had an easy go of it through the community process about parking is the little one on West Broadway that we're working on. That's a pilot project for D&D. It's a city-owned site, and it's 15 units, and it's 100% affordable for the South Boston CDC. And so as soon as you take away the skepticism of the community toward the market rate developer, where they just don't believe it. You can be talking, you just go blah, 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 right? Where you say people aren't going to use the parking, but it's really because it's cheaper for your development is what they're perceiving. Instead, it's like they actually see the benefit that these 15 units are going to serve people from their community who are low income. Then suddenly the parking issue went away when we showed pictures of here's the senior citizen who's living, who needs a place in South Boston, who's lived there all their life. They don't have a car, they're going to live here. Here's the young couple who makes this amount and they don't have a car and they're going to live here. And when we put sort of faces to those people, then the neighborhood kind of the whole thing just quelled down because they really believed that it was for a greater purpose and it benefited them.
And Tamara and her team did an awesome job with this because it was at 100% affordable building in South Boston with no parking, and it was completely embraced. And that's not what you would expect from a development with those characteristics. And it was because, exactly what Tamara just said, they saw it as serving their community.
And another big argument for no parking is also what you would spend to park your car. It could be like $300, $350, $400 a month additional to park your car. That's money you can spend on rent. Those are people who would maybe live in these workforce housing units too. So that's a big chunk of what your monthly rent is going to be. So there's a big argument for cutting.
So I think one key is, while we're not talking about affordable as with the capital A and we're talking about affordable with the little a, is to kind of conjoin the word workforce with affordable in the community's mind so that they see workforce as, that's your kid who's right now sleeping in your basement because they can't afford, or that's your parent who is in your house because they can't afford X, right? And so to be able to make it personal and still feel like workforce is helping everybody would be like a great
I guess
thing to come
I
out of
want
that
to do the
conversation.
balance thing again, in which I'm not giving up my car. I don't have to drive it everywhere, but I'm not giving it up. And so so I need a place where I can park it every day and leave it there. And I might be willing to pay for that as opposed to we ain't having no parking at all. Because everybody doesn't live like the young couple who, can't afford a car. And sort of that kind of thing. So, my kid is at home. He lives at home. I would love for him to have a micro unit somewhere that I didn't have to pay for, but he doesn't even know how to drive. right? He and his friends, they don't even know how to drive.
Right.
And
My
so
kid either.
he doesn't
want to learn to drive.
Yeah, like, so I understand that thing, but I promise you, the place where he starts to make enough money, then he can get a car because that translates to freedom for him, right? Or choice and that kind of thing. And so, like, I didn't learn to drive till I moved here because, you know, I was amazed when I moved here that the subway shut down. How helpful is that at 2 o'clock in the morning when I'm trying to come from clubbing? And so, you know, I just wanna advocate for, like, let's not extreme everything, and we gotta have a right
We did
place.
talk about this when we were master planning.
It's baked
Tim
into
and I.
the. It's baked into the. We're providing parking as part of this master plan.
Yeah.
And I think
On
that
Brian Healy's site, we
on
made
Brian
him
Healy's, and
Tim
against the
Healy.
tracks. But to get the units up so they have the good views. But I think that these middle scale sites that aren't in Rosendale and they're not downtown is where it's middle class, middle lifestyle expectation.
Yeah.
It's not the super hipster.
Right.
I'm not sure that micro units belong quite on the sites that we're talking about. They might want to be closer to downtown. There might be a sliding scale of unit sizes and how far you are from the Mass Ave boundary or something. But I agree with Crystal. I mean, I think that the problem, I think, with the housing debate is that every project is a kind of monoculture.
Right.
This project is micro units.
Right.
This project is all ones and twos, you know. And one of the things that I talked about with some of the people involved with the charrette is, what if you had 2 bedrooms, micro units, 2 bedrooms, micro units, so that you could have your mother-in-law move next to you, break open the wall or not, and you could have an extended family, right? So I think that there's a mix of unit
We'll have a
types.
lockable wall.
Have to agree to have
On Tuesday it's open,
yeah,
on
exactly.
Wednesday not so much.
So I think that buildings are of a scale of the charrette, I would encourage, I like the live work idea. It's great for the district we're talking about, but also combo platters so that it's more like the triple decker, so that maybe short term it's micro twos, but 20 years from now they all get converted into 3 bedrooms. I don't know. So I think that some future forecasting of the possibility for tinkering with the plans would be something that no one's really tried before. That I'm going to try to whisper in everybody's ear about some agendas here, but I think that that's one too. That
Well, and on the parking front, I think that, you know, the promise of the growth zone and master planning a growth zone means that you could set aside a certain piece of it for structured above ground parking.
That's right.
Right, which is a much more affordable option than having every single site have to solve their own parking
Yeah.
problem
Right. That's
individually, and then it ends
and
up
that could be a public-private
underneath,
partnership where
which
the
is too
developers
expensive.
come in and it's
Right.
much cheaper than building their own parking. They pay a little bit into the
Right.
sauce, and that would be much more affordable
Or
than
you're
everybody
near a
building
T,
their own parking.
right? You're near a T, so
Right.
you could actually, whoever wants to in the units could rent the space, and if there's excess, it just goes to people commuting.
I totally agree with the balance also.
You go ahead. Last one.
And that's why I would just advocate for a slightly lower parking ratio, not eliminating parking by any means, maybe going to a 0.4, something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
So of course, about half or maybe a little less are gonna want to keep their cars. I agree with you.
Yeah.
Okay, I just thought that maybe you were starting to get into tomorrow's activities here, and that, you know,
Well, we have
you have
certain
to leave
audience
something
members.
for the rest of the 3 days.
Some of the audience members have a particular interest in figuring out what to do. So.
I just want a question back there, and then one question from Hubert, and then I'm going to wrap it up.
So this is a comment and a question. The Andrew Square Civic Association actually got together and actually in 2005 put out sort of their master plan for the Andrew Square area. It would be an interesting quick read. It's 6 pages, but they are very articulate about what they need. And one of the things they talk about is mixed use. That more residential, good, but they've got a lot of residential. What they don't have are places to get together as a community, places to come together. So the open space and the idea, but also things that would happen at the ground floor of all these places. They have no street life. I mean, it's tough around Andrew Square.
We make some retail into the.
Yeah, you need to put it in the mix. You just take a quick look at their master plan that
Can
they
you
put
get
together.
it to us so we
Yeah,
can distribute it?
I'll send it to you.
Okay, awesome.
Thanks.
Hubert?
I just want to endorse what Tim is saying. I think that, you know, the monoculture is absolutely death to a neighborhood. And if you can design a neighborhood that is intergenerational, that is basically an epitome of the extended family, even though people may not actually be related. They do look after one another, whether they're very old or very young, and there are people hanging out all the time. There are seniors. In my next 20-year plan, I'm looking for an elevator and an accessible apartment, in which I do not live right now. And yet I am competing with the up-and-comers for that sort of space. And it's economically not feasible. Cambridge is even more of a sort of economic hothouse for housing than Boston.
So Renee, I know you want to wrap up.
Okay.
But in my 2.5 months in government, I've learned how to have the last word. So anyway, I do want to echo, again, what these guys are saying about sort of intergenerational neighborhoods, and really encourage us all to think about that as a good typology that's durable over time. And the city of Boston can think, because the city of Boston is not unique in terms of its neighbors. So Cambridge is having the same problem, and Somerville is having the same problem, and Quincy is having the same problem. So if we could sort of think about an approach that can be regional and fit into different kinds of communities, that would be great. And also an approach that, one of the things I'm learning is like there's a world outside of Boston, and talk about supply and demand and how that impacts things. And so if there's a design model that works as well in Greater Boston as it might work in a slightly less urban environment that makes room for different kinds of family lifestyles, and that I think it could go a long, long, long way. So, and then Ricky can make history like she's trying to do.
Everybody gets one last word.
Yeah, Ben, I do want you to Justin, while we're talking about this diversity of ages, I just wanted to also stress how important I think diversity of all kinds is to building a healthy community. So mixing of incomes, mixing of skill sets, mixing of ages, mixing of ethnicities and races. That's how you build a healthy community, and that's what we're trying to do. And I think that's what everybody's trying to do here. So it's diversity of all kinds.
Yeah.
I could not agree with that more, Ricky. That's homogeneous neighborhoods don't work, right? So we want to make sure that as folks go forth and into the charrette, how is this supporting the idea of a really heterogeneous community that's really tied into the fabric of what existing South Boston and existing Dorchester, and is enhancing and making that neighborhood more vibrant. And I think I'm really excited to see what comes back on Thursday. So I think that everyone's sort of heard that challenge and looking at senior housing, and workforce housing, and student housing, and how we might mix that all together. I also, in my last word here, also want to put a plug in for, I mentioned the innovation lab that we're starting in a couple weeks here. We're actually hiring for a innovation lab director, so I think there might be some folks here. Ricky we're going to have to hire her to be our promotional expert for the housing plan, so that job's already covered. But if anyone's interested in working in government for a couple-year fellowship, love to talk to you.
I guess for my last word, the micro-housing thing I've kind of gotten stuck in this box, and I really appreciate what you added, which was, it's not really about micro unit, it's really about just making sure that the housing that we build is sort of focused more on singles and couples, because that is our demographic. And so, micro or not, it feels like wherever you look, whether it's Portsmouth, New Hampshire, or it's the Cape, or wherever, when we do that quick analysis of what's the household size versus how many units of each type, we end up with this incredible mismatch, because we've been building family type housing for so long. And as we all know, at least I'm finding out, the years that you're a family, because families generally are so much smaller today, if you only have one kid or two kids, you're only a family for 20 years, right? And otherwise
you could be a family of one.
Well, right. But there's a lot of time in your life when you don't necessarily want to be living with a whole bunch of roommates. So, I'm going to end there.
I think what Sullivan said about diversity is key. I think diversity in you know, who we're building for, who we're designing for, but also in the built fabric. And I think what fascinates many of us designers is that housing really is the fabric of the city, you know, in a way that other uses aren't, but it's not housing alone, you know, and how housing can support everything that we love about neighborhoods, and how it could help make, you know, one neighborhood more unique from another is something that really is a great design challenge. And I really look forward to seeing, although I won't be here, but I look forward to seeing the results of the shred. We're watching on TV, great, awesome, perfect.
Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. This is really, really great. Thank you.
That was great.
Everybody can have